There are stories that begin with a bark, a wagging tail, a happy leap into someone's arms. This isn't one of them. This one begins in silence, deep echoing silence, where trust had been broken too many times to be given freely again. 15-year-old Ivy didn't go looking for a miracle. She just wanted to understand why some soul's animal or human retreat so far into themselves they forget how to come back out. And one cold morning in the foothills of Bitterroot Valley, she met a pair of eyes that seemed to ask the same question. The dog didn't move, didn't growl, didn't beg. He simply watched as if weighing every breath, every flicker of light, every person who had ever disappointed him. Most people walked by, but Ivy stopped, and that single pause, that one quiet moment of seeing without judging, would change both their lives. What happened next isn't just about a rescue. It's about what it means to be safe, to be seen, and how healing often begins not with fixing, but with waiting. So who was this dog no one dared to touch? And what made a teenage girl stay when everyone else walked away? Let me tell you, the Bitterroot Valley is breathtaking in winter. Pines blanketed in snow mountains rising like ancient guardians, and a hush that seems to make even time slow down. But tucked behind a modest veterinary shelter on the outskirts of Red River Hollow is a structure not made for beauty. A steel-sided isolation kennel reserved for the animals no one knew how to help. That's where they kept him. His name was Scout. He had no collar, no tags, just a metal intake number and a file thick with warning signs. Scout had been found 6 weeks earlier chained to a rusted-out trailer deep in the woods. The man who'd reported him had gone hiking and heard faint clinks of metal. When he followed the sound, he found Scout gaunt, caked in mud and half frozen. There were marks on his legs from old bindings and scars around his muzzle. No food, no shelter, just survival. At the shelter, he didn't lash out the way some might expect. He didn't bark for attention, didn't howl at night. He simply withdrew. Sat motionless in the corner of his enclosure for hours, refusing food if anyone was near. If someone got too close, especially a man, he would bare his teeth and growl low and long, the kind of sound that made even experienced handlers take a step back. They tried placing a blanket in his crate. He shredded it to pieces. They left a radio on low for background noise. He snapped at the speaker. At one point, Scout chewed through part of the kennel gate, not to escape, but seemingly just to prove he still could. What people saw was aggression. But any behaviorist worth their salt knows that fear wears many disguises, and the most dangerous one is silence. When a dog no longer reacts with noise, but with stillness, that's when trauma runs deepest. Scout became the dog no one wanted to deal with. Volunteers whispered his name with pity. His file was labeled unadoptable. Every time a potential adopter passed by, staff members gently steered them elsewhere. He's not ready, they'd say. What they meant, though, was, we're not sure he'll ever be. It's a hard truth in rescue work. Some animals don't come back. Not completely. And when shelters are overcrowded, those animals, no matter how deserving, often don't get more than a quiet corner to wait out their time. But what if Scout didn't need to be fixed? What if he needed something no one had tried yet? Not obedience training or medication or forced socialization, but time, space, and above all, choice. That answer didn't come from the staff or from another dog expert flown in to evaluate him. It came from a 15-year-old girl named Ivy Parker, who didn't flinch when Scout stared her down, who didn't try to reach into his cage, who simply sat still, soft-spoken, watching him the same way he watched her. But that moment hasn't happened yet. To understand why it mattered, you have to meet Ivy. Not just the girl who stopped outside a kennel, but the one who'd been waiting all her life to see something in someone no one else could. Let's go back to where Ivy's story begins. Ivy Parker had the kind of quiet most people overlooked. Not the shy kind, but the still kind, the kind that noticed things. The way her mom's left eyebrow twitched when she was worried. The soft flutter of a bird's wings when it was deciding whether to trust her hand. or the way certain dogs didn't growl to scare you. They growled because they didn't know what else to do. She was 15, homeschooled since 7th grade, and lived with her mom in a small cedar house nestled at the edge of the forest line. Her room overlooked the back pasture where deer sometimes wandered close and coyotes sang in the cold. She liked drawing animals, reading books about behavior science, and watching documentaries about wolves. Ivy didn't have a lot of friends, not because she was strange, but because she didn't force herself to fit. Her mother, Dr. Allison Parker, was a trauma therapist who had once worked in big city hospitals before settling into private practice in Bitterroot Valley. She had seen how grief reshaped people, how trust eroded one moment at a time. But even with all her training, Allison still carried one heavy regret, a failed patient from her past. A former combat vet with PTSD who stopped showing up to sessions after a confrontation went wrong. Allison had been trying to help, but pushed too hard, too fast. Since then, she had avoided the hard cases, human or animal. Ivy knew this, and maybe that's why she kept her grief tucked in tight. Her father, a park ranger, had died when she was 9, caught in a flash flood while helping evacuate hikers. Since then, Ivy stopped talking much about sadness. She turned it into sketches, into long walks, in the way she never interrupted an animal when it was speaking, even silently. She and her mother shared something unspoken, a deep reverence for pain. Not the dramatic kind, but the slow, aching kind that lives in silence and shadow. So when Ivy asked her mom to visit the rescue shelter on a cloudy Saturday morning, she wasn't looking to adopt a dog. She just wanted to see how dogs behaved in captivity, how they coped, how they chose to show distress or hide it. But what neither of them expected was Scout. He didn't bark, didn't move, just watched. And Ivy, standing there in her wool coat with her sketchpad tucked under her arm, watched back. That moment, that mutual stillness, was when something shifted. Not in the dog, not yet, but in Ivy. Because when she looked into Scout's eyes, she didn't see a monster or a lost cause. She saw a soul fractured, yes, but not gone. Just waiting for someone who would stay long enough not to be afraid. And it wasn't bravery that made her return the next day. It was recognition. Because sometimes the parts of us that are most broken are the ones that know how to recognize pain in someone else. And when Ivy sat outside Scout's kennel again, this time without saying a word, he didn't growl. He didn't turn away. He blinked, slowly, like he was listening. And that's where their story truly began. The second time Ivy came to the shelter, she brought her sketchpad, not because she planned to draw anything, but because it gave her hands something to do. Scout's kennel was exactly where she remembered, tucked at the far end of the row metal gate, slightly warped, a faded sign still hanging, "Do not approach without staff." But Ivy didn't plan to reach in. She just wanted to sit. She lowered herself to the floor about 4 feet from the gate legs, crossed back against the opposite wall. From that distance, she could see everything, the way Scout kept his body coiled, tail tight to his ribs, ears, back pupils wide. He wasn't resting. He was waiting for the next bad thing to happen. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He didn't look away, and neither did she. For 47 minutes, Ivy didn't speak. She didn't sketch. She didn't even shift her weight. She simply sat, her presence soft and patient, like sunlight that never forces itself through the clouds but waits for the wind to part them. And in that time, something subtle happened. Scout's breathing slowed. His jaw, once locked tight, relaxed just slightly. And when a staff member walked by with loud boots, Scout didn't lunge like before. He flinched, yes, but he didn't snarl. His eyes darted to Ivy, then back to the floor. He had noticed her. Afterward, Trish, one of the senior volunteers, found Ivy still sitting there. "He's never stayed that calm for this long," she whispered. "You didn't even do anything." But Ivy knew differently. Sometimes not doing anything is exactly what matters most. Later that day, she told her mom something small but important. "I don't think he's angry. I think he's exhausted. I think he's been protecting himself so long, he forgot how to rest." Allison listened quietly, something in her daughter's words hitting close. Ivy's insight wasn't random. It was earned through years of feeling what it was like to hold your breath in a room full of people wondering if anyone noticed you were trying. This was the beginning of what animal behaviorists call co-regulation, when one nervous system begins to find safety by mirroring another's calm. It doesn't happen through force. It happens through trust, through time, through someone saying without words, "I'm not here to fix you. I'm just here with you." That night, Ivy drew her first picture of Scout. Not snarling, not hiding, just sitting beneath a pine tree, his eyes open, watching the world from a distance. She left it at the shelter the next morning, folded gently in half and slid beneath his kennel door. No name, no message, just a silent offering. And Scout didn't tear it up. It would take more than drawings and silence to earn his trust, but something had begun to shift, something fragile but real. And the next step Ivy knew wasn't hers to take. It was her mom's. The shelter's meeting room wasn't fancy, just a long table, mismatched chairs, and the scent of coffee that had sat too long on a warmer. But that day the air felt heavier. Everyone on the adoption board knew why they were there. Scout's name was printed at the top of the agenda, underlined twice in red ink. Dr. Allison Parker sat at the far end, her coat draped over the back of her chair, fingers laced loosely in her lap. Ivy sat beside her, silent, observant, sketchpad pressed flat against her legs. She wasn't there to argue, just to listen. Trish, the senior volunteer, opened the meeting gently. Dr. Parker has submitted a request to foster Scout under therapeutic supervision. It's an unusual ask, given Scout's record. Unusual was putting it mildly. Dr. Griffin, the shelter's veterinarian, leaned forward. "He's dangerous. That dog has lunged at 3 different handlers. He's not stable. He's not safe. He's scared." Allison replied, voice calm but steady. "Everything in his behavior says trauma, not aggression. He's never bitten, never made contact. His reactions are classic hypervigilance, not attack." Still another board member added, "You're a single parent. You have a child in the home." Allison nodded. "And that child has been spending time with him. Quietly. No touching, no speaking, just presence. And he's responding." Someone scoffed gently. "With all due respect, anecdotal calm isn't proof of rehabilitation." "No," Allison said, "but it's proof of possibility." She explained her plan. Scout would live in their guest studio, completely separate from the main house. Supervised interactions only, weekly check-ins, video updates, and if at any point Scout regressed dangerously, he'd be returned immediately. A few members remained unconvinced. "Why, you one asked? Why this dog?" Allison took a breath. "Because I've seen what untreated trauma looks like in humans, in animals. And I've made mistakes before trying to fix instead of listening. This time I'm offering something different: space. Patience, no expectations." It was Ivy who spoke next, surprising everyone. "He doesn't need us to heal him. He just needs to not be alone while he figures out how." There was silence. Then Trish leaned in. "I've watched them. Scout doesn't growl at Ivy. That may not mean much on paper, but out there it means everything." The vote wasn't unanimous. 4 in favor, 3 against. But it passed. They left with a signed agreement, a list of conditions, and cautious hope. Scout would have a trial period, 6 weeks. No promises, just a chance. On the drive home, Ivy stared out the window, hand resting on her sketchpad. "What if he doesn't come inside?" she asked softly. "Then we wait," her mother said. "Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't rushing in with answers. It's being willing to begin with uncertainty." And when they returned to the shelter 2 days later, Scout was watching from his corner. Still, silent, but not turning away. Scout didn't enter the house on the first day, or the second. Allison had prepared a quiet guest studio behind the main home, a converted tool shed with windows facing the trees, insulated walls, and a soft fleece bed in one corner. No mirrors, no loud sounds, just stillness. She left the door open and backed away. Ivy sat a good 20 feet back, her arms wrapped around her knees, saying nothing. It took Scout almost 2 hours to take a single step inside. He didn't explore, he didn't lie down. He simply crossed the threshold, turned in a circle, and stood with his back to the door, ears flicking at every sound. Allison didn't close the door that night. She just left a space heater on low and a bowl of food in the far corner. By morning, the food was gone. Each day followed a rhythm, quiet mornings, slow movements, no eye contact, unless Scout initiated it. Ivy left a small drawing beside his water bowl every morning, a pine cone, a deer, a tree with tiny hearts hidden in the leaves. Scout never touched them, but he didn't shred them either. That, Allison said, was a kind of yes, but healing never travels in a straight line. On day 7, Ivy entered the studio without knocking. She'd just returned from a walk, cheeks pink from the cold boots, still damp with melted snow. Scout was sleeping lightly near the window. When Ivy dropped her backpack by the door, the sudden noise startled him. He sprang up, eyes wild, and backed into the wall. A low growl rippled through his chest, not a warning, but a plea. Ivy froze. Allison, who had been watching from the hall, was stepped in. She didn't scold. She didn't soothe. She just knelt slowly and said, "Let's give him space, love." That night, Scout didn't eat. He curled in the far corner of the room and trembled, flinching at the sound of even the kettle boiling. Later in the kitchen, Ivy stared into her tea. "I scared him," she whispered. "You startled him," Allison said gently. "That's different. Fear lives in his body, not because of us, but because of where he's been." It was a hard lesson. That love, even when offered gently, can still feel like danger to someone who's known only harm. And that trust doesn't grow just because you want it to. It grows because you honor its pace, not your own. By day 10, Scout was eating again, this time while Ivy was still in the room if she sat quietly enough. When she opened her sketchpad, he watched. When she turned a page, his ears twitched. He still flinched at sudden noises, but the growling had stopped. It was progress. Fragile, incomplete, but real. And the moment that changed everything came not with food or praise, but with a bell. A tiny silver bell strung from a ribbon hangs softly beside the back door. The next step would be his to take. It started with a ribbon and a bell. Ivy had seen the idea in a training book once, giving a dog a way to signal their needs without fear. She tied the little bell to the back door handle low enough for Scout to reach with his nose. If he wants to go out, she told her mom, he can choose. We won't guess or push. He'll tell us when he's ready. At first, the bell just swayed gently in the breeze whenever the door opened. Scout noticed it but didn't engage. He still paced near the windows when restless, circled when anxious, and sometimes scratched lightly at the door frame when he wanted something but didn't know how to ask. Allison didn't rush the training. She simply walked Scout to the door each morning, gently tapped the bell with her knuckle, then opened the door. No commands, no pressure, just repetition and patience. After a few days, Ivy tried it too. Soft tap, open the door, a pause, eye contact. Then they'd walk outside together, no leash, just a trailing lead and a whole open yard of space. Scout never ran. He stayed close. But he hadn't yet initiated. Until day 13, it was late afternoon, pale winter light stretching long shadows across the hardwood floors. Ivy was sitting at the table sketching a scene from a book she loved. Trees, rivers, a girl standing beside a quiet dog. Scout stood up from his resting spot by the fireplace and walked to the door. He stared at it, ears pricked. Then, with the softest nudge, his nose brushed the bell. It rang, just once. Ivy froze. Allison looked up from her notebook. No one moved. Scout looked over his shoulder. Not afraid, not questioning, just waiting. Ivy stood slowly and opened the door. Scout stepped out. Calm, intentional. He walked into the snow-covered yard, circled the perimeter, and sniffed the tree trunks. He was no longer the dog trapped in a kennel. He was choosing his place in the world, one step at a time. Later that night, Ivy drew the bell hanging like a tiny silver promise and Scout standing tall beside it. "This isn't just progress," Allison said, studying the drawing. "It's participation." She explained how in trauma recovery, human or animal, one of the biggest milestones isn't obedience. It's a choice. When someone begins to believe their voice matters, healing starts to root deeper than behavior. It touches identity. The bell wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol. "You're allowed to ask," and Scout had asked. But what they didn't know was that just days later, Scout would make a very different kind of choice. Not for himself, but for someone else. And this time it would happen in the middle of the forest, in the middle of a storm. The storm rolled in just after sunset. Thick clouds smothered the moonlight, and the wind began to howl through the trees with a low, steady groan. Allison lit candles around the living room while Ivy layered blankets over the windows. The power had flickered twice, then gone out completely. No heater, no Wi-Fi. Just the crackling of the fire and the sound of branches tapping softly against the siding. Scout paced at first, not in panic but in unease. Change still unsettled him, the shift in light, the silence between gusts of wind. But unlike before, he didn't retreat to the back studio. He stayed close, watched them as they moved through the room. His body was tense but not tight. Ivy had set up a nest of quilts near the fireplace, 3 thick layers and 2 pillows side by side. She invited Scout with her eyes, not her hands. "You can sleep close if you want," she said, gently patting the blanket beside her. He didn't come, not then. But sometime around 3 in the morning, Allison stirred and glanced over to find Scout no longer at the doorway. He was curled beside Ivy, his flank barely touching her knee, chest rising and falling in rhythm with hers. Ivy's hand was resting near his paw, open but relaxed, like she'd fallen asleep mid-reach. Neither had moved, and for the first time, Scout wasn't just near, he was with. The next morning brought more than snow. Ivy had a fever low, but enough to make her cheeks flushed and her steps slower than usual. Allison brewed tea on the gas stove and wrapped her daughter in blankets. Scout never left her side. He sat tall, alert, watching every motion like a sentinel. Then came the knock. A sharp, unexpected knock at the front door. Scout was on his feet in a heartbeat. He moved fast, but not wildly. No barking, no panic, just a straight, determined path to the door. He planted himself between the handle and Ivy body, rigid ears forward, eyes locked. Then came the growl. It was deep, low, and protective. Allison stepped in slowly. "It's okay," she called out toward the door. "Please leave the package on the porch." Outside, the startled delivery man nodded, set the box down quickly, and walked away through the snow. Only when the truck pulled off and the wind settled did Scout begin to relax. His shoulders softened, his head lowered, but he didn't leave the spot. "You were protecting her," Allison said softly, her voice thick with something more than gratitude. "You stood your ground." Ivy, still weak, but smiling, whispered from behind the blankets. He didn't just stay. He chose to stay. And that was the difference. Before, Scout had been surviving. Now he was guarding something, someone. He had claimed them not out of fear, but out of connection. And that connection would soon be tested in a way none of them could have predicted. Because 2 days later, deep in the forest, Scout would make a choice that would save a life. The invitation came on a crisp morning in early spring, an official letter from the shelter board typed neatly and signed in blue ink. After reviewing Scout's progress and behavioral reports, they ended the monitoring period. No more check-ins, no more conditional forms. Just one final request: would Allison and Ivy return with Scout to speak at the shelter's community day? Ivy read the letter twice. Then she folded it quietly and slipped it into her sketchbook. They returned a week later, parking beneath the same pine trees they'd walked past months before when Scout still wouldn't look anyone in the eye. Now he stepped calmly from the car, ears forward, tail relaxed, his eyes scanning the space not in fear but with quiet confidence. He walked beside Ivy without a leash, pausing only once at the shelter door. She smiled, whispered something he didn't need to understand in words, and together they stepped inside. Staff members stared. One of the volunteers gasped. That's Scout Trish, the volunteer who had seen their first meeting, placed a hand over her heart. He looks soft, and he was. The same dog who once shredded blankets in panic now allowed a toddler to pet his back as Ivy spoke at the front of the education room. She didn't talk like a kid. She talked like someone who had learned by living. Scout didn't become a good dog because we trained him. He became who he is because we gave him space to feel safe. Allison added softly. He didn't need to be controlled. He needed to be trusted. They shared the Bell story, the fireplace at night, the snowstorm, and the hiker. Ah yes, the hiker. 2 days after Scout had stood guard during the delivery, Allison had taken him on his usual trail walk while Ivy rested at home. Scout had darted into the woods, then stopped over a shape half buried in snow, a young man with a twisted leg barely conscious. Scout didn't bark. He stayed, nudged the man's arm, waited beside him until help came, not afraid, not fleeing, present. He chose not to run. Allison told the room. He chose to stay with someone who needed help, just like Ivy once did for him. That was the moment the room went quiet, and in that silence, something settled. Scout wasn't just rehabilitated. He was home. Back at their cottage that night, Ivy tucked her newest drawing into the wooden frame above the fireplace. 3 figures beneath a blooming apple tree, a girl, a woman, and a shepherd dog, with one paw stretched toward the light. She'd labeled it with a single word: Spring. Above it on the same shelf sat a small certificate from the shelter recognizing Ivy Parker as a junior animal care volunteer. Not a big deal, she'd said shyly when she got it, but it was. Because in a world quick to label discard or fear what it doesn't understand, Scout had become a living reminder that trust isn't earned through force, but through presence. And for Ivy, it wasn't just the end of a rescue story. It was the beginning of who she was becoming.